The sanitariums. Dreadful secret. The first glimmer. It started as a rumor whispered among the urban explorer community. The Gold Spring Sanitarium, a hulking relic of 19th century Gothic architecture, had sat decaying on the outskirts of town for over 50 years. Its windows were shattered, its walls covered in graffiti, and its history stained with the kind of horror that drew thrill-seekers like moths to a flame. But lately, something far stranger had been reported. At dusk, the windows, long devoid of electricity, began to flicker with light. Flashing patterns spilled out, erratic and unnatural, like some forgotten Morse code. Some claimed they heard laughter echoing from inside. Others swore they saw figures moving in the upper levels, visible only for a heartbeat before disappearing into darkness. When I proposed the idea of checking it out to my friends, most of them dismissed it. Only 3 agreed to come. Marcus, a self-proclaimed skeptic who loved debunking ghost stories. Ava, who was oddly fearless about these things. And Chris, our gearhead who insisted on bringing a backpack stuffed with cameras and flashlights. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the 4 of us approached the sanitarium, flashlights in hand and nerves jangling. That's when the first flash came. Bright and blinding, like lightning, but silent. For a moment, it felt like the air itself vibrated. The sanitarium's broken windows glared down at us, their jagged edges catching the light. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the flash was gone, leaving us blinking in the dim twilight. "I guess that's our invitation," Marcus muttered, trying to mask his unease with sarcasm. But the truth was, none of us felt ready for what awaited inside. A welcome of whispers. The door groaned when we pushed it open, an agonized creak that echoed down the darkened halls. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the unmistakable stench of mildew and decay. Our flashlights swept across the peeling wallpaper and shattered furniture, illuminating streaks of dark stains that trailed along the floor. "It's colder in here," Ava said, rubbing her arms. She was right. The temperature seemed to drop by several degrees the moment we stepped inside. We moved cautiously, our footsteps crunching on broken glass and debris. The long hallways seemed to stretch infinitely, with doors on either side leading into what once must have been patient rooms. Each room we peeked into was a graveyard of abandonment. Rusted bed frames, overturned chairs, and medical equipment coated in a thick layer of dust. And yet, there was something off. The silence wasn't complete. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but as we ventured deeper, we all began to hear it. Whispers, soft and indistinct, like a distant conversation held just out of earshot. Marcus stopped and shined his flashlight down one of the hallways. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Chris asked, though his voice was strained. "A laugh," Marcus said. Low, like he trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind." No one wanted to admit it yet, but we were all hearing things. The first scream. We decided to split up to cover more ground. Marcus and Ava took the eastern wing while Chris and I headed toward the western side. It was a bad idea and we all knew it, but no one wanted to look scared. Chris, always the techie, had a thermal camera with him. "This place is giving off major dead zone vibes," he joked nervously. He held up the camera and scanned the area, its display casting a faint green glow. The screen showed nothing unusual, just cold walls and empty corridors. For a moment, his tension eased. That was when we heard it, a blood-curdling scream. It erupted from somewhere deeper in the building, high-pitched and filled with such raw terror that it froze us in place. Chris fumbled with the camera, his face going pale. "That wasn't Marcus or Ava, was it?" he whispered. Before I could respond, the scream came again, closer this time. I grabbed Chris by the arm. "We need to find the others." We retraced our steps back toward the central hallway, calling their names. Our voices echoed, but there was no reply, only the sound of our own ragged breathing and the faint hum of whispers that seemed to grow louder with every passing moment. The moving shadows. When we finally found Marcus and Ava, they were standing in front of a massive steel door. It looked out of place compared to the rest of the decayed sanitarium, as though it had been added long after the building was abandoned. The surface was smooth and unmarked, but the air around it felt charged, like static electricity before a storm. "What's behind it?" Chris asked. Marcus shook his head. "No idea. But when we got close, we thought we saw..." He hesitated, then gestured at the far end of the hall. "Just look." We turned, and for the briefest moment, I saw what he meant. Something moved down there. A shadow, not cast by any of our flashlights, slipped across the corridor and vanished into one of the rooms. "I'm not going in there," Ava said, backing away. "Neither am I," Marcus added quickly. For once, his skepticism seemed to falter. Chris, however, was already fiddling with the steel door, trying to see if he could open it. He muttered something about it being magnetically locked and started unpacking a device from his bag. But I couldn't focus on him. My eyes kept drifting back to the darkened hallway where the shadow had disappeared. I thought I could still see it, standing just out of sight, watching us. Laughter in the dark. While Chris worked on the door, the rest of us huddled together, trying to keep our nerves from unraveling. That's when we heard it again, the laughter. It wasn't like the whispering. This was sharp and clear, echoing from somewhere deep within the building. It started softly, a chuckle that quickly grew louder and more manic. The sound was wrong. Too high-pitched, too joyful, like the cackling of a madman who had seen the end of the world and decided it was hilarious. Chris froze mid-motion, his tools clattering to the floor. "Tell me you heard that," he whispered. None of us answered. Instead, we turned our flashlights toward the hallway, where the laughter seemed to be coming from. As the beams of light swept across the walls, they caught movement again. A figure, hunched and shambling, just barely visible before it disappeared around a corner. "Okay, that's it. We're leaving," Marcus said, already backing toward the entrance. But when we turned to follow him, we stopped cold. The entrance was gone. Not boarded up, not blocked, just gone. The corridor that should have led back to the front door now ended in a solid wall of cracked plaster. Ava grabbed my arm. "What the hell is happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the laughter erupted again, this time closer. Doors that shouldn't be. Panic set in. We spun in circles, searching for any sign of the entrance. It had to be there, it just had to be. But no matter where we shined our flashlights, all we saw was the same cracked plaster stretching endlessly in every direction. "I don't understand," Chris muttered, his voice strained. "We just came from there." The laughter echoed again, bouncing off the walls. It was louder now, but it didn't sound like it was coming from a single place. It was everywhere. "We need to move," Ava said, grabbing Marcus's arm. "Standing here isn't safe." Chris hesitated, looking back at the steel door. "Wait, I almost had it open. Maybe..." "No," I interrupted. "We stick together. That's the only rule right now." We started walking, sticking close and keeping our lights trained on the hall ahead. As we moved, the walls around us seemed to shift. The corridors turned at impossible angles, twisting and branching in ways that didn't make sense. More than once, we found ourselves back in places we were sure we'd already passed. Rooms that should have been behind us now somehow ahead. And then there were the doors. At first, they seemed normal, wooden with peeling paint and rusted handles. But as we ventured deeper, the doors became stranger. Some were made of steel, with heavy locks and scratch marks gouged deep into their surfaces. Others were padded, like something you'd find in an asylum. A few were chained shut from the outside. One door, covered in faded green paint, stood slightly ajar. Inside, the faint sound of something wet squelched in the darkness. We didn't look inside. The portrait room. Eventually, we stumbled into a large room. It must have once been a common area for patients. There were remnants of couches and tables, all covered in layers of grime. But what caught our attention were the portraits. Dozens of them lined the walls, each one framed in tarnished gold. They were oil paintings of people. Doctors, nurses, patients, and others we couldn't identify. Their faces were detailed, almost hyper-realistic, but something about them was off. Each figure's eyes seemed to follow us as we moved through the room. "This is new," Chris said, holding up his thermal camera. "These paintings shouldn't be here. No one's maintained this place in decades." Ava stepped closer to one of the portraits, a woman in a nurse's uniform. "Look at her eyes," she whispered. "It's like she's staring right through me." As if on cue, the lights in the room flickered, dim, sputtering bulbs that we hadn't even noticed were there. For a brief second, the faces in the portraits changed. Their expressions twisted, mouths stretching into grotesque grins, eyes wide with manic glee. And then the light returned to normal and they were just paintings again. "Did you see that?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the laughter started again, this time coming from the walls themselves. It was joined by another sound, the slow, rhythmic scrape of something sharp being dragged along the floor. "It knows we're here." We bolted out of the portrait room, our flashlights swinging wildly as we ran. The scraping sound followed us, relentless and unhurried, as if whatever was making it knew we had nowhere to go. The hallways seemed to close in around us. The walls felt tighter, the air heavier. My lungs burned as I ran, but I didn't dare stop. We turned a corner and came face to face with another steel door, identical to the one we'd seen before. This one, however, was slightly ajar. Cold air poured out from the crack, chilling my skin. "We're not going in there," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Do we have a choice?" Chris shot back, his face pale. The scraping sound grew louder, echoing off the walls. Whatever was following us, it was close. Too close. Without waiting for a vote, Ava shoved the door open and darted inside. One by one, we followed, slamming the heavy door shut behind us. The room we entered was unlike anything we'd seen in the sanitarium. The walls were lined with medical equipment, monitors, syringes, jars filled with murky liquid, and things floating inside them. The faint hum of electricity filled the air, even though there was no visible power source. In the center of the room was an operating table. Strapped to it was a human figure, covered in a stained white sheet. The outline of its body was grotesque, with limbs that bent in unnatural angles and a chest that rose and fell with labored breaths. Chris stepped closer, despite our whispered warnings to stay back. His flashlight shook as he reached for the sheet. "What are you doing?" Ava hissed. "I need to know," he replied, his voice trembling. He pulled the sheet back, and we all recoiled in horror. The thing on the table wasn't human, not anymore. Its skin was pale and translucent, stretched tightly over protruding bones. Its face was a twisted mockery of humanity, with empty eye sockets and a mouth filled with jagged teeth. As we stared, its head snapped toward us, and it let out a wet, guttural scream. Nowhere to hide. The creature on the table thrashed against its restraints, its inhuman wails piercing our ears. Chris stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. "Go! Go now!" Ava shouted, shoving us toward the far end of the room. There was another door, a smaller one, almost hidden behind a cluster of metal cabinets. We didn't think. We just ran, throwing it open and spilling into another hallway. But the hallway didn't look right. The walls were covered in jagged symbols carved deep into the plaster, and the floor sloped downward at a steep angle. The air smelled of rot and copper, and the whispers were louder than ever, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. "We need to find a way out," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "This place is alive. It's messing with us." "No kidding," Chris muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Behind us, the door we had come through slammed shut with a deafening bang. For a moment, the only sound was our ragged breathing. Then, from the darkness ahead, a new sound emerged. Heavy, uneven footsteps. A game of cat and mouse. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a wet, dragging noise. Whatever was coming for us wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to be. Chris raised his thermal camera and pointed it down the hallway. "I think it's..." Before he could finish, a shape appeared on the screen. It was massive, nearly filling the width of the corridor, and its heat signature flickered erratically, like it wasn't entirely solid. "We're not waiting to find out what that is," I said, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. We ran blindly, the hallway twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. At one point, we passed an old gurney covered in fresh blood, its wheels squeaking as it rolled toward us of its own accord. At another, a door we passed suddenly burst open, revealing a room filled with nothing but mirrors. In one of the mirrors, I saw something move, a figure that wasn't one of us, standing just behind me. When I turned, nothing was there. The laughter returned, louder and more unhinged, as though the sanitarium itself was mocking us. And then, from somewhere far behind us, we heard the thing chasing us let out a guttural, inhuman roar. It had started running. The cries of the past. Our lungs burned as we sprinted down the endless hallway. The roar of the creature behind us reverberated off the jagged walls, a sound so raw and feral that it made the air itself seem to tremble. Every instinct screamed at us to keep moving, but the corridors twisted and branched so chaotically that it was impossible to tell if we were running deeper into the sanitarium or towards some sort of escape. The walls became increasingly distorted as we ran. They pulsed like living flesh, bulging inward one moment and outward the next. The symbols carved into the surfaces glowed faintly now, illuminating the path ahead with an eerie red light. "I think it's toying with us," Ava panted as we rounded another corner. "The whole place is a trap." "It's not just a place," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "It's alive. It wants us here." As if in response to his words, the whispers that had followed us since we entered suddenly grew deafening, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. They spoke in a language none of us understood, but the tone was unmistakable. Rage, despair, hunger. The whispers rose to a crescendo and then a scream. It was a man's voice, filled with agony and terror, echoing from somewhere ahead. We froze, unsure if it was real or another trick. Then it came again, clearer this time. "Help me, please, God, help me." Chris looked at me, his face pale. "What if it's someone like us? What if they're trapped?" Before I could answer, the scream cut off abruptly, replaced by wet, choking gurgles. The lost ward. We approached cautiously, flashlights quivering in our hands. The hallway opened into a massive room, a ward, judging by the rows of beds lining the walls. Most were empty, their frames rusted and mattresses shredded, but a few still held shapes beneath filthy sheets. One of the beds near the center was moving. The figure on it writhed weakly, its limbs jerking in unnatural spasms. As we drew closer, the stench hit us. Rotting flesh, acrid sweat, and something metallic. Ava gagged, covering her mouth, but none of us could look away. The person, or what was left of them, was horribly disfigured. Their skin was pale and stretched taut, veins bulging beneath the surface like black vines. Their eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, and their mouth opened and closed as though trying to scream, but no sound came out. What is this?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're trapped," Chris said, his voice thick with horror, like the whole building froze them in time. As we backed away, something shifted behind us. One of the other beds creaked, and then another. The shapes beneath the sheets began to move, one by one, jerking to life as though awakened by our presence. The whispers returned, now interspersed with faint giggles. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Chris by the shoulder. "Now." The hall of hands. We fled the ward, but the laughter followed us, growing louder and more childlike. It wasn't the same high-pitched madness we'd heard earlier. This was softer, almost playful, but somehow far worse. The corridor ahead narrowed until the walls were only a few feet apart. Our flashlights revealed smudged handprints covering the plaster, dozens of them. No, hundreds. Pressed into the walls, floor, and even the ceiling. They varied in size, from tiny toddler hands to enormous ones with unnaturally long fingers. "What is this place?" Ava whispered. Chris scanned the handprints with his thermal camera. "They're warm," he said, his voice trembling. "These walls are radiating heat." Before we could react, the handprints began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. The impressions stretched and distorted, fingers curling and uncurling as though trying to grasp something, or someone. One of the hands reached out of the wall and grabbed Marcus's sleeve. He screamed and yanked himself free, but not before the fabric tore, leaving a long gash on his arm. "Run!" Ava shouted. The corridor seemed to come alive around us, the walls rippling as more hands reached out, clawing and grasping. One brushed against my shoulder, ice cold despite the heat radiating from the walls. I didn't look back. None of us did. The endless stairs. The hallway finally opened into a stairwell, its rusted metal steps spiraling upward into darkness. Without hesitation, we began to climb, the sound of our footfalls echoing through the tight space. The laughter faded behind us, replaced by a low, rhythmic pounding, like something heavy slamming against the walls below. "We can't stop," I said, my legs burning as I took the steps 2 at a time. "Just keep moving." But as we climbed, the stairs seemed to stretch. No matter how far we went, the top remained out of sight, the spiral looping endlessly. Worse, the pounding from below wasn't fading. It was getting louder. "What if we're going in circles?" Marcus asked, his voice frantic. "What if there is no top?" "There has to be," Chris replied, though he didn't sound convinced. Then, as we rounded another turn, we saw it. A door at the very top of the stairs, marked with a single red handprint. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it, faint light flickered. Relief washed over us until we heard the sound behind us. The pounding had stopped. In its place came a wet, slithering noise, accompanied by a low growl. I glanced back, and for a brief moment, I saw it. A massive, hulking shape crawling up the stairwell, its limbs too long and its face obscured by shadows. We threw open the door and scrambled through. A hunger that waits. The room beyond the door was massive, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected our terrified faces in infinite repetition. A single chair sat in the center, its surface stained with dark, dried streaks. Chains dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly despite the absence of wind. The door slammed shut behind us with a deafening clang. Marcus rushed to pull it open again, but it wouldn't budge. "We're trapped," he said, his voice shaking. The mirrors flickered, their reflections warping. In the glass, I saw things that weren't in the room. Figures moving in the shadows, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. One by one, the reflections turned to face us, their mouths opening in unison. A voice spoke, not aloud, but directly in my mind. It was deep and guttural, filled with malice. "You've seen too much. You don't leave. You become part of me." The chains above us rattled violently, and the mirrors shattered all at once, plunging the room into darkness. And then we heard it, the slow, deliberate footsteps of something entering the room. The thing in the dark. We froze, the sound of footsteps echoing in the pitch black. They were heavy, deliberate, and impossibly close, yet none of us could see a thing. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my hands trembling as I fumbled to switch it back on. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, I wished it hadn't. Standing no more than 10 feet away was it. The creature's hunched form barely fit the height of the room. Its skin was a patchwork of raw flesh and leathery scars, stitched together with black thread that seemed to pulse like veins. Its arms were grotesquely long, tipped with jagged, claw-like fingers that dragged against the floor. Worst of all was its face, or what passed for one. Hollow eye sockets glowed faintly with an unnatural yellow light, and its mouth stretched into a too-wide grin, exposing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It didn't move at first, just swayed slightly, as if deciding which one of us to take first. Then it cocked its head and let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate inside my skull. "Don't move," I whispered, though my voice shook so badly I wasn't sure the others could even hear me. But Marcus panicked. He bolted toward the far wall, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. The creature turned its head toward him in one unnaturally fast motion and screamed. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. A sound of pure rage and hunger, so loud it made the floor beneath us tremble. Marcus didn't make it far. The creature lunged, its claws catching him mid-stride and slamming him into the ground. His scream was cut short as the thing dragged him into the shadows, leaving behind only a smear of blood. A labyrinth of madness. The door behind us was still locked, and with Marcus gone, it was clear the creature wasn't going to stop. Ava grabbed Chris and me, pulling us toward a faint glimmer of light on the far side of the room. It was another door, smaller, unassuming, but open. We sprinted through it, slamming it shut behind us. The creature's growl echoed from the other side, followed by the sound of its claws raking against the metal. The new hallway was even worse than the last. The walls weren't just cracked, they were alive. Veins pulsed through the plaster, and something thick and black oozed from the cracks, pooling at our feet. The air was suffocating, heavy with the scent of iron and decay. "What is this place?" Chris whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's not just a building," Ava said, her eyes darting around. "It's a trap, a feeding ground. It's been waiting for people like us." Her words sent a chill through me. The sanitarium wasn't abandoned. It was alive, and it had been feeding on the lost souls who dared to enter. The endless pursuit. We didn't stop moving, too terrified to linger. The corridors seemed to shift around us, looping back into themselves and twisting into impossible angles. Doors appeared where none had been before, while others vanished as soon as we approached. The sound of the creature's claws never stopped. Sometimes it was distant, faint enough that we thought we'd lost it. Other times, it was so close that I swore I could feel its rancid breath on the back of my neck. At one point, we found ourselves in a room filled with broken wheelchairs. They were scattered haphazardly, their wheels spinning slowly as though something unseen had just passed through. One of the chairs began to move on its own, rolling toward us with a loud squeak. Then another followed, and another, until the entire room seemed alive with movement. "We have to go!" Ava screamed, shoving past the chaos. We barely made it out before the wheelchairs slammed into the walls, the sound echoing like gunshots. The heart of the sanitarium. At last, we stumbled into a vast chamber that didn't seem to belong in the building at all. The walls were lined with glowing symbols, and in the center of the room was a massive, pulsing mass. It looked like a heart, fleshy and grotesque, with thick, black veins snaking out from it and into the walls. The whispers were deafening now, drowning out everything else. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were thoughts, invading my mind and filling it with images of despair and death. "This is it," Chris said, his voice barely audible. "This is what's keeping this place alive." As if sensing our presence, the mass pulsed violently, and the ground beneath us began to shake. From the shadows, the creature emerged, its glowing eyes fixed on us. Chris fumbled with the camera in his bag. "I think I can destroy it," he said, pulling out a small device. It looked like a crude bomb, cobbled together from wires and a block of plastic explosive. "What? Where did you even get that?" Ava asked, but there was no time for answers. The creature lunged. The price of escape. The next moments were chaos. Chris shoved the device into my hands and yelled, "Set the timer. 5 minutes." Before I could protest, he threw himself at the creature, tackling it with a strength I didn't know he had. The two of them crashed into the wall, and the beast's roar echoed through the chamber. "Go!" Chris screamed. "Don't stop. Just go." Ava and I didn't have a choice. I set the timer on the device, dropping it at the base of the pulsing heart, and we ran. The corridors blurred together as we sprinted, the walls shaking violently as the sanitarium seemed to fight back. Doors slammed shut in front of us, but we forced our way through, driven by sheer adrenaline and terror. Finally, we saw it, the entrance, the real one, just as we'd remembered it. The fresh air hit me like a shock, and we burst out into the night just as the ground beneath us erupted in a deafening explosion. The sanitarium collapsed inward, the roar of destruction swallowing the whispers and laughter at last. Dust and debris filled the air, but Ava and I didn't stop running until we reached the road. We never spoke about what happened to Chris or Marcus. Some nights, I wonder if Chris managed to destroy that thing for good. Other nights, I swear I hear laughter echoing in the distance, faint and mocking, as though the sanitarium still waits for its next visitors.